questions after the movie, you can ask in the lobby because we have to clear up. So basically this documentary takes as its starting point what we call the Reformasi era in Malaysian politics, which was 10 years ago, 1999. And I was just talking to Kipling after that and said, what's interesting about the Malaysian Reformasi era as opposed to the Indonesian one is that it failed. But he kind of disagreed with that, so maybe he'll talk about it more. Yeah, he has a full paper, but maybe you won't have time to read it. But you can get his new book, Arrested Reform: The Undoing of Abdullah bin Abi. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Hi. Yeah, I have a paper here that I'm not going to read from it, of course. I just have a few minutes. The day we are celebrating is, of course, September 20th, 1998, which was in a way the day that saw the culmination of a lot of dissatisfaction started a year earlier. Triggered off by the financial crisis, of course. And we saw how from 1997 until 98, Malaysia went through a great crisis. And what happens after that recommends that we should welcome crisis, but crises are not always bad things. A lot of things get shaken up and a lot of public space gets created during crisis. What we saw on September 20th, 11 years ago now, was the largest demonstration following the breakout between the conflict between Mahathir and his deputy Anwar Ibrahim. And the momentum that Anwar was having behind him became so great that Mahathir had to strike on September 20th. And what happened that day is what I think the film is trying to reenact in some ways. Yeah, why I do not totally agree with Reformasi being a failure is that because of what's happening now, and I see that as a continuation of what started then 10 years ago. I think a lot of young Malaysians were made politically conscious by the demonstrations of that time. Now, although most of the demonstrators were Malays, I think a lot of non-Malay Malaysians were very much affected by it. I would like to suggest one psychological point there. I think up until that point, because of the NEP, because of decades of racialism, I think the races were separated by a nagging suspicion that the other side was in on a silent conspiracy against them. I think that's what racialism does to you over a long period of time. You don't trust the other side, and you keep a certain distance, a comfortable distance. And I think the Reformasi saw a breakdown of that, and I think Malaysians after that, especially young Malaysians, dared to get closer to each other across racial barriers. Of course, this happened in a smaller, well, among certain individuals, I'm sure. But now, 10 years later, I think what's happened today, March 8 elections, where we see a conscious, much more politically conscious voter base reacting against the system that the BN had built up, comes from that period. But of course, at the same time, we have to point to the fact that in 2004, the BN actually managed to absorb most of the dissatisfaction into itself. So, in a sense, yes, it's a bit contingent to look at that the Reformasi has culminated in what it is today. The BN could have stopped it, I think, in 2004 if it had been serious about its reforms. Meaning that it did read the ground right, but it did not see how serious the issue was. And so did not carry out the reforms. They failed in the reforms, and so the dissatisfaction that was expressed in the Reformasi returned in a way. And I think what's most important about that whole period is that we now have a whole group of young Malaysians, post-May 13 generation, I would say, that's taking over, and they do not, I think, they do not succumb to politics of fear as easily as Malaysians have done up until that point.
Okay, thanks. So talking about young Malaysians, Charlene here, she's had many encounters with young Malaysians in various forms.
You want to specify encounters? I mean,
So, what's interesting about the kind of movement you're talking about, where younger people are getting, they feel like they're together in some cause. People who you never thought would collaborate before. And what often happens in any society where this happens is that you will have an explosion in the arts as well to deal with that. So we have here Charlene to talk more about that. In terms of film, I can safely say none at all, especially in mainstream feature filmmaking, because it's expensive to do and blah blah blah, and they have to worry about censorship. So there were no mainstream feature films that dealt in any way with Reformasi. But two footnotes. One is there was a film made by what was one of the Reformasi activists at the time. It premiered here in the Singapore Festival in '98. It's called From Jemapo to Manchester. And by the time it was released, the director was under the Internal Security Act. Not because of the film, but because of demonstrations, organizing demonstrations. But now he's out. So that's one footnote, even though the film itself is not overtly political. The second one is the only film that dealt heads-on with the idea of film censorship was actually a horror comedy called Pontianak Penjerit. Which is, if you know Malay, it's an odd phrase to use because a Pontianak doesn't normally scream, Penjerit. It will wail in real life. So the title itself is funny. There's one scene in there where two people are driving up Fraser's Hill and complaining about the censorship board. So look at these idiots, they allow all these foreign horror movies in, but they don't allow local horror movies. Yeah, they're really morons. They think and that whole scene was allowed uncut. So so that was kind of a landmark moment where a Malaysian could see censorship board being made fun of. So it's like before Royston Tan did it. So so Charlene can talk about what happened actually to the young ones.
Well, firstly, I think theatre had to deal with the fact that, and I speak mainly for theatre rather than music and dance as well, visual arts, but I'll speak a little bit. Theatre had to deal with the fact that there was no drama on the streets, and the stage was nowhere near as compelling. And that was the reality. You turned on the news, and it was high drama. It was black eyes, it was a performing mattress, it was sodomy and adultery, and it was scandal galore. So theatre had to rethink what it was going to do in that kind of space. And as Keeping says, a crisis can be a good thing. I think the Chinese character says a time for opportunity or something like that. But I think what the arts community was concerned with was to find and create, in a sense, non-partisan dialogue spaces where people could really rethink what was going on, because the shock, the bewilderment, the sense of what's happened here, I mean, how do we relate to the state, hadn't been something we thought about. Perhaps 30 years before that, as a result of May 1369, artists thought about it. And they did galvanize at the time, and they did, at that point in time, I think, empathize with the state and have a sense of wanting to be aligned with what was going on. So artists like Said Alwi, Usman Awang, Ran Razali, Krishan Jit, and a range of others, those were mainly theatre people, Said Ahmad Jamal, Piadasa, worked with the state to try and reform. But now this was reformasi, and it was about then reviewing the relationship with the self and the state. And so Artist Proactive was born, and it became short form for APA. And APA put together a festival, unprecedented, we've never had anything like that before, of musicians, dancers, writers, visual artists, theatre practitioners in different venues. A shop lot became a gallery, a jazz cafe, theatre space, the actor studio, and people created work in response to what was going on the streets, on the media, as a thinking space. To give you an example, one performance that I thought was very powerful, directed and put together by Liao Pui-Tin, performed by Zahim Al-Bakri, was simply the reading of the penal code, which most of us didn't know, had never heard, had never read, obviously. Because one of the questions is, what are our rights? We pretend to be informed, but we aren't. What happens if we are arrested? We don't know. So the arts community was galvanized into thinking about that and trying to ask these questions and provide platforms for them to be thought about in, hopefully, a dialogical